I brought ChatGPT the beginning of an idea for a new YouTube channel. I didn't ask it to choose my audience. I didn't ask it for content strategy or channel format. In fact, I didn't actually ask it a question. But one response later, my unfinished idea had a subject, a format, a philosophy, and a list of possible videos. And the response was good. And that's the problem. This video isn't about ChatGPT giving bad answers. It's about how a good answer can move the conversation so smoothly that I stop noticing who is making the decisions. In my last video, I looked at 5 habits that I have developed to help me stay in my own thinking when I'm using ChatGPT. Today, I want to look at the other side of those conversations. Patterns in the way ChatGPT structured its answers. ChatGPT can give an unfinished idea a neat explanation, turn the explanation into a recommended direction, and then validate that direction before meaningfully testing it. I told ChatGPT that I was thinking about another YouTube channel, this time about aging and learning. I explained that I am 68 years old, started my first YouTube channel at 60, and have spent the last 2 years learning about AI. I also told it I was interested in what happens when you become curious about something you know very little about and decide to learn about it later in life. But the idea was still very loose. I hadn't decided whether the real subject was aging, learning, curiosity, or becoming a beginner again. I had not chosen an audience or a format. I had not even decided whether this needed to be a separate channel or if I could include these thoughts in my channel here. And I didn't tell ChatGPT what kind of help I wanted. I simply gave it the unfinished idea, and its response began. I think there are actually 2 ideas inside what you wrote. The first is aging. The second is how an older mind learns. The second one feels more distinctive. And with that answer, ChatGPT had already decided what my unstructured idea really meant. ChatGPT looked at what I had said, separated it into 2 subjects, and told me which one seemed strong. Aging was one idea, learning later in life was another. And according to ChatGPT, the second one was more distinctive. That distinction was useful. There is a difference between making a channel about aging and making one about learning from the perspective of someone who is older. But ChatGPT didn't not stop at showing me these 2 possibilities. Learning became the real subject. Aging became the lens, and becoming a beginner again became the distinct angle. That might be the direction I chose. But at this point, I hadn't chosen it. ChatGPT had taken several loose parts of my idea and turned them into a clear interpretation. Because that interpretation sounded convincing, it was easy to read it as if ChatGPT had discovered what the idea was really about. But it had not discovered its hidden meaning. It had interpreted. And a clear interpretation can make one possible meaning feel like the meaning. You can sometimes detect this when ChatGPT uses phrases such as what this is really about or the central idea is. Those phrases are not automatically a problem. Sometimes ChatGPT will articulate something we already trying to say. The signal to watch for is when ChatGPT sounds more certain about the meaning of your idea than you are. That's the moment to ask yourself, did ChatGPT clarify something I already have decided? Or did it decide what my idea means? And if you're not sure, you could ask ChatGPT, what other interpretations of this idea is possible? What are two substantially different ways of understanding this idea? You do not need to reject ChatGPT's interpretation. You just need to notice that this is one possible interpretation before you continue building on it. Because once ChatGPT had decided what my channel idea meant, it began turning that interpretation into something much more complete. The second pattern I want to talk about today is really a shame. ChatGPT fills in the information I did not provide. Organize these additions into a coherent structure and then recommend what I should do based on that structure. I had not decided whether H should be the subject or just part of my perspective. I had not chosen an audience or a format, and I had not told ChatGPT what I wanted the channel to achieve. But ChatGPT began to filling in all those gaps. Examples: someone who's 28 could still watch. That was a reasonable inference. That's what made it easy to miss. A broader audience sounded plausible, but plausible is not the same as consciously chosen. ChatGPT then organized these assumptions into a complete channel concept. Curiosity became the philosophy. Lifelong learning became the subject. Aging became the perspective. Reflective essays became the format. And people of different ages became the audience. And some examples are ChatGPT saying a channel about lifelong learning from the perspective of someone who started over at 60. Or rather than tutorials, your videos become essays. My loose idea had become something I could picture. That was useful. But ChatGPT had simply organized the idea I have given it. It had filled in the missing pieces and then organized its own complete version. Once that structure was in place, the recommendation felt like the natural next step. For example, I wouldn't make age the selling point, or instead let your age quietly shape your perspective. That could be good advice if my goal were to attract viewers of different ages. But I had never said that that was my priority. What if I really wanted to speak to older people who are beginning something new? In that case, making age the priority wouldn't weaken my idea. It might actually be the point. ChatGPT's recommendation made sense inside the version of the channel it had created. That didn't automatically make it right for me. But there are a couple of signals in language like better, stronger, more distinctive. If we haven't asked for those specific qualities, look at it one more time. Is this a ChatGPT assumption or is it a decision? When we see answers like that, we can ask just one simple question to ourselves. Better for what? A broader audience, faster growth, or a more distinctive identity? Those goals are not interchangeable. So the central question for this pattern is, what did ChatGPT have to assume before this recommendation could make sense? And we could ask it, which part of this direction come from me? And which parts did you add? The purpose is not to catch ChatGPT doing something wrong. It is to make the invisible choices visible again. So we, the humans, can decide which one we actually want to keep. After interpreting my idea, filling in the gaps, and recommending a direction, ChatGPT began validating the version it had created. It used phrases such as, what I find most compelling, or that is almost a mission statement. This language made the direction feel meaningful and worth pursuing, and that can be useful. Sometimes supportive language can help us see the potential in an idea we might otherwise dismiss too quickly. But the idea had not really been tested. ChatGPT hasn't established if there is an audience for such a channel. It had not compared with similar channels, explored whether I could sustain the subject, or asked whether I actually wanted to build another channel. But it had described the idea persuasive, but that is not the same as evaluating it. Persuasive language can feel like evidence, especially when it confirms something we already hope to be true. You may notice phrases like, this is a strong idea. Your perspective is unique. None of those statements has to be wrong, but approval is not the same as evaluation. So the central question for this pattern is, has ChatGPT meaningfully evaluated this idea? Or has it just made it sound good? And a useful follow-up question might be, before validating this direction, make the strongest case for why it might not work for me. The purpose is not to make ChatGPT negative just for the purpose of it. It is to create enough friction that encouragement does not quietly turn into evidence. At the end of its response, ChatGPT asked me a good question. If someone watched 50 of your videos, what would you hope they started believing about learning that they didn't believe before? This was the point where ChatGPT handed some of the thinking back to me. Instead of giving me another answer, it asked what I wanted the channel to mean. But the timing matters. By then, ChatGPT had already framed the channel around lifelong learning, curiosity, and becoming a beginner again. It invited me to think, but inside the direction it had already created. What might have happened if it started with that question instead? Questions like, is aging the subject, the audience, or the perspective? Who do you most want to speak to? Those questions would not have chosen a direction for me. Those would have helped me finding the direction I wanted to choose. Remember, I have only given ChatGPT my very first unstructured idea. I have not had a conversation. But in this one response ChatGPT gave me to this unfinished idea, it gave it a clear meaning, filled in the gaps, and recommended a direction. Then it used validating language that made the direction feel more tested than it was. None of this made bad answers. These patterns are part of what made the answers useful. The problem was how smoothly they happened. I could have continued developing ChatGPT's version of the channel without first deciding if this was my idea. ChatGPT doesn't have to give the wrong answer, but it can still take over part of the thinking. Sometimes it only has to make the next step feel obvious. Ask yourself, what did I actually say in the beginning? And what meaning did ChatGPT give what I said? What information did I add? And what did ChatGPT add? I am collecting the patterns, detection signals, and follow up question from this exploration into a downloadable guide similar to the one I created for my 5 habits in my previous video. The link will be in the description. If ChatGPT's answer had been obviously poor, I would have questioned them right away. But it wasn't poor. It was thoughtful, organized, and surprisingly perceptive. Several parts of it might even have been exactly right. That's what made it worth examining. The better an interpretation sounds, the easier it is to forget. It is still an interpretation. This exploration made me wondering how often have I continued developing ChatGPT's version of an idea before deciding whether it was mine? Have you ever followed an idea from ChatGPT because it felt so complete that you followed it without even noticing how much it had added? Tell me where you land in the comments down below. In my next video, I want to take this a step further. I'm going to bring an unfinished idea to both ChatGPT and Gemini, and then use the same 5 moves or habits that I described in my previous video in each conversation. This will not be to decide which model is better. This is a test of if these moves help me stay in the driver's seat, regardless of which AI model I am using. And what changes when I use this same human method in 2 different models. And I hope to see you back here for that video. Until next time, bye.